All right, everyone. Well, we might as well get underway here because it's almost 25 to. I gather that there are going to be a few other people coming in who sent their apologies. They'll show up late-ish, having had other commitments on other parts of the campus. Hi. So it's my pleasure to welcome Xenia Morin here today. We met 4 or 5 years ago, I guess, when I was down at your invitation to give a couple of talks and participate in some workshops that were related to the Princeton Environmental Institute's work on climate change as it related to food security. And it was the, what was it, the Hot and Hungry Planet? Feeding the Hot and Hungry Planet, which was a very interesting international workshop and conference that has since led to other kinds of interesting developments with the Earth Institute putting in the NSF grant. And in the intervening period, I moved here, and Xenia is still an adjunct at Princeton with the Environmental Institute, and it certainly works closely with them on teaching and student mentorship and a bunch of other things that you've been doing over the years in addition to the research and conference planning. But now she's just moved within the past month up the road a little bit to Rutgers University, and she's got an enormous long title here, so I'm going to try to make sure I get all of this correct. She's now the Associate Dean and Liaison for Sponsored Programs in the Office of the Executive Dean at the School of Environment and Biological Sciences, which is part of the old Agricultural College of Rutgers University, which is one of the oldest and certainly largest and most renowned in the U.S. And it's very interesting now because it's a new network of colleagues that we share at Rutgers University, which, if you're not familiar with them, they've had a long-standing tradition of excellence in agricultural systems thinking, as it relates not only to ecological matters, but also to issues around development, so the industrialized and developing country context and knowledge translation. Now, so that's you know that.
Yes,
now they know that, this is good. The talk, food portfolios and resilient food systems and food security is something that we've been talking about for many years, one way or the other. The food portfolios is a new addition to the vocabulary, so our vocabulary, moving away from just food security, now talks about resilience and is now talking about food portfolios. The reason why this is so relevant to us here at Inogen is that we're preparing bids sometime June, July, that will be dealing with food security, but our approach will be to be thinking about these things in terms of systems, agri-food systems, and to think about the way in which food insecurity arises as a systemic phenomenon and becomes sometimes crystallized into the structure of food systems. And this, I think, is where actually the concept of resilience in food portfolios that we described today will be very useful to help us get some more systematic thinking about the work that we intend to do, because the strong tradition within the food security literature is to think about a productionist model of just figuring out ways of getting more out of arable land, getting more marginal land into arable, getting more out of that, figuring out how to have fewer inputs, and so on and so forth. And we're trying to move out of that kind of productionist model into thinking about something that is actually much more systems oriented. So we'll be very interested to hear what you have to say about this concept of resilience and systems, but also the food portfolio part of it as well, because we certainly notice that within much of the food security literature, agriculture is something that takes place over there, not here. It's not urbanized, it's not community, and you've got a lot of experience with community agriculture that you can draw on to talk about the way that food portfolios can include local activities as well as modern industrialized kinds of things. So that's another kind of ulterior motive for having you here to talk about the food portfolio. So All of my confessions about motivations for having you up here are there on the table now, and so I'd just like you to give your presentation in about 45 minutes or an hour tops, and then we'll have a Q&A after that.
Yeah, actually, if before we start, I could just find out what your backgrounds are, and so
yeah, that's
just give me your name and your background.
My name is Kim. I have an undergraduate degree in business studies, where I specialized in economic development. I'm doing a Master of Science in Science and Technology Policy and Management at University.
Hi, my name is Claire. I'm doing a Masters in Science and Technology Studies. Okay, I'm Janija. I have an undergraduate degree in biotechnology and doing a Master's in Science, Technology, Policy Management.
I just wrote a thesis in Science, Technology Studies / History of Medicine. What are ideas of diet and nutrition in relation to health, in particular public health?
Great, wonderful.
I'm Jennifer Emergence Communications Officer. I'm particularly interested in creating my backgrounds in public health nutrition, so that's kind of the side that related to work.
There's a little bit in there, don't worry.
I'm Bruce. I'm a research fellow working for the for a centre researching genomics and social aspects of genomics, but I have a background in animal genetics.
Okay, great.
Michele Massoni, I'm a research fellow at Engine and also doing work on life science innovation, but just trying to brainstorm a few ideas for a proposal which actually involves biofuels and its connection to agriculture and food security as well. So.
Michelle Bashin, and in the business school at Edinburgh University, also the associate, the imaging, and my background is science and technology studies, but at the moment in imaging, working on the rice system and also involved in food security, trying to put together a research proposal.
Exactly. No, I appreciate more and more how much work goes into proposals. So a little bit about me. I got my undergraduate degree in biochemistry at the University of Toronto, and while I was there, I got very interested in plants, photosynthesis, and went on to Cornell, where I spent a year doing agronomy, figuring out cold tolerance in rye plants, and then moved on and looked at photorespiration for my thesis. So I'm probably one of the few plant biochemists that still is floating around, because that has kind of died. But later went on into plant cell biology, a bit of molecular biology. When funding in the plant world died, I moved over to cystic fibrosis research for a while, because I was really interested in how membranes served as barriers. And I think this issue of barriers has been a theme throughout my academic life, of figuring out how to lower barriers and bring different groups of people, or, in the case of organisms and ecosystems, bringing things together. And so I view myself now as an interdisciplinary person, meaning I'm more of a generalist. I have some depth in places, but I love to talk to different audiences to get ideas and to generate interdisciplinary discussions, which is why I wanted to know what your backgrounds are. And I think some of you can be of great help to me today as well. So I want to make this into more of a conversation. So this is really an overview of my talk. I want you to know a little bit more about what I do and where I come from and the kind of the food world I inhabit. So I'm going to give you a background in that, and how my work has changed over the years and the different pieces that I focus on now. I want to introduce you to this idea of a food portfolio as a concept, and one that I think might be useful, and then spend a little time talking about its implications for resilient food systems and food security, and then to really open it up to have a discussion so that this isn't just a one-way discussion. So one of the things that I've realized is I'm asking a lot of questions as I approach this, as I hope you are as well. And part of it is to be reflective of my own work, and that is, how have I been discussing the food system? When I teach in the classroom, what is it that I say? What are the types of things that I'm drawing on in order for me to understand the food system? And how do I help to share that with others? And then I'm asking, how can we better discuss our food systems, resilient food systems and food security? How are there barriers in our language or our inability to capture certain things that are going on in the food system? And how can we rectify that? So how can we talk across disciplines and address issues that are concerned to all of us? And then my final question is really, can adding new language and a new framework help to bridge the divisions between our different disciplines and allow us to move forward? So this is very much a work in progress, and I thank you for inviting me here and to kind of throw my ideas out and see what you have to say, because I really do want to stimulate a conversation. So the background to my work. So when I ask myself, how have I been talking about food and the food system at work, I realize I've been talking about it on lots of different scales. So when we talk about it globally, I teach a course this semester called Biotech Plants and Animals. So of course we look at the emergence of biotech crops and their relationship to conventional crops, particularly commodity crops. So I use data from ISAAA, which looks at the rise of this technology. So if you're not familiar with this graph, this is the years, and then this is the area in acres or in hectares. And this is the adoption of biotech crops since 1996. And what I like about this graph is it shows that it's not only something that's been happening in the industrial countries like the United States, but also in developing countries. Now, this gives us a view that things have been changing, but we don't necessarily know how they've been changing until we look at the breakdown of the different crops. And so one of the things I'm interested in is, how does each biotech crop penetrate its market? Has it become a big player, such as the case of soybean, that's approximately 81% of all soybeans, versus cotton, or maize, where there's a much less penetration of the biotech crops, or canola. Now, David has told me that in Canada that number is probably 98%.
0.5.
Okay, so this is 98.5%, so there are a few holdouts. But regionally, this is going to vary, but to look at the aggregate data tells us something, but when we look at a particular country, we may see different trends in the adoption of biotech crops. And these are ones that are insect resistant, or Roundup resistant, herbicide tolerant, or have stack traits. I also think about it globally, as in where in the world is food produced. And again, this data from ISAAA, looking at the different countries, and I'm sorry that you can't read this. If you go onto the website, you can look more detailed. But it shows that North America, South America, and Asia are the main places that you're going to find these crops. And as you well know, there's been a lot of controversy in Europe, that you have a few places now that are growing it. But when you look largely all over Africa, as of last year, there's very little. You go to find out where the field trials are going on. You have many field trials and new biotechnology regulatory frameworks being implemented, and this part of the map is likely to change over the next 5 years. So understanding geographically where things are grown and how that plays into trade and relationships between countries is also a way that I talk about the food system. So these are aggregates, but I also want to talk about, on a global level, what's the environmental issues related to food. So when I think about food systems, we often think about water and what agriculture is doing. And last fall, I spent some time looking at hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico, which is this region right here. But it made me ask the question, well, where else is hypoxia an issue? And right now, it's believed that there's over 400 level. Yes?
What's hypoxia?
Oh, sorry. Hypoxia is hypo, meaning less than, oxia for oxygen. So it's places in the ocean which are depleted of oxygen. Okay? And so this usually happens when there's excess nutrient runoff that allows photosynthetic organisms in the water to overgrow. And when they crash, they start to be decomposed, which takes oxygen out of the water. And so this is an issue. It's associated with many centers of high density of population, in part because of the sewage that goes into the system, but it's also associated with agricultural regions where there's a lot of fertilizer, and the fertilizer goes into the water and then runs out into the ocean. And in particular in the United States, if you look at the Mississippi River, which runs in the middle of the United States, it actually covers about 2/3 of the United States. It's a huge river basin. And so when you hear about flooding of the parts of the Mississippi, it's because its watershed is so huge. But it turns out that some of these areas, especially in the Midwest, are corn growing areas. And these areas have excess nutrient runoff that ultimately lands down here in the Gulf of Mexico. And so when we think geographically, we can think not only about the crops that are grown, but the interactions of the crops with the environment, and then how that may not be geographically stable, but may move to another area. So the consequences of upstream behavior is not necessarily felt, but it's felt down here. And so that the impacts may be separated globally or geographically. And that's one of the biggest challenges of when we're talking about what's going on, is to think about these as big systems and not necessarily small when we're looking at global environmental issues. I've also been spending time thinking about the relationship between food and health. Last semester, I ran a policy workshop with graduate students in the Woodrow Wilson School of International and Public Affairs. And in the middle is the report that we produced for a group called the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is located in New Jersey, which is where I'm located, and they're very interested in figuring out how to change the food landscape in America for healthier eating. Certainly we have a lot of leadership at the top in the United States. The president tasked a White House task force on child obesity to try and understand the reasons. Michelle Obama has stepped up and taken that as her piece of being the First Lady, and she's looking at not only food but activity, and her Let's Move initiative is something that's gotten a lot of press. And so when we think systems-wise, we need to think about not only what we're growing, but what the consequences are for the nation as a whole. And certainly the United States is not alone in its obesity epidemic, although I think we are certainly ahead of many other places with the number and severity of the obesity crisis and all of the peripheral effects of diabetes and heart disease and chronic disease. So I start to think about what are people eating, where they are, and how does that affect their health. So just to give you a bit of a geography lesson, this is the northeast of the United States. Here's New York. I think most of you can put New York on the map. I actually live, I don't know why this keeps doing this, so let me turn up again. I actually live right about here in central New Jersey. This is largely industrialized around New York, but when you get to me, there's actually small towns and farms outside. So 5 minutes from my house on my way to Princeton, I pass a soybean farm and I pass cows. And so down here is Philadelphia. You go a little further, this is Delaware, down here Baltimore. And if you go up this way, there's Boston up here. Toronto and Ottawa, where David used to be. My family was here. And so for me, this is kind of my food universe and where I travel. I spent 2 weeks up in Vermont, in Burlington, Vermont, looking at local food systems. And when we talk about geography, one of the questions I had is, what are we doing in central New Jersey that's the same or different than what Burlington, Vermont is doing? and how are smaller states with less urban population handling local food systems. And it turned out, actually, there's a lot of similarities. The Princeton area has a lot of local food being developed, and so does Burlington, Vermont. But since you mentioned interest in urban food systems, when you look just at this region right here, 20 million people, so equivalent to London. If you go further up and along, closer to 30 million people. So one of the things that I'm noticing is that when New York does its food plan, it figures out where its food potential is from, they draw a big circle. It includes all of New Jersey, right? When Philadelphia does the same, it draws a big circle. It includes New Jersey. And so what I think we have going on right now is a lot of double counting. When people think about what our regional food system is, they go, oh, well, it's all of this part of Pennsylvania and this part of New York and all of New Jersey. And New Jersey's nickname is the Garden State. And for many, many years, we were the prime produce makers for places like New York. Now this area up here, the Hudson River Basin, provides a lot of food going into New York. But New York, with so many people, relies on many of the ports to bring food in. Now, bananas, if you want bananas, actually come in to a port of Wilmington. Almost all of the bananas for the East Coast going out to Indianapolis all come in through this one port right here. So again, it depends on where or what the product is, where it's coming from, and how it reaches our area. So I think about it geographically. I think about how far things are going. I think about the way the food arrives in the cities. But I also think about how they each will count New Jersey as its source. Now, New Jersey itself has 8 million people. So New Jersey, we know, cannot even feed itself, let alone the two big cities that are closest to us. So we have the potential for food crisis. A report that was done about 5 years ago by Brian Schilling at Rutgers on behalf of Homeland Security did a calculation, and there was basically 3 days of food in New Jersey at any given time. That we very much rely on just-in-time delivery, and that we don't necessarily have all the warehouses filled up to sustain us in a natural or man-made disaster for more than 3 to 5 days, if we just count what's in stores and warehouses. Now, people obviously have varying amounts of food in their houses, but some would be more vulnerable than others. Another place where I've been observing food is in the school setting, in particular school lunches. I've sat on my local school board, health and wellness committee, which is in charge of school lunches. And over the last 5 years, I've seen a lot of changes in the offerings. So there are salad bars now. You can get pre-made sandwiches or have sandwiches to order. Many of the fried goods have been changed to baked goods. These have all been the result of a national policy that required a wellness policy being instituted in all the schools. The problem is this, though, that when you actually go into the cafeteria and observe the students, it's what I call the sea of beige. So all the food looks beige. You don't see the colored vegetables. You don't see lots of things on the plates, particularly in the middle school years. So the younger children can be encouraged sometimes to eat food, although when they're losing all their teeth, they can't necessarily navigate all the food as well as you might like. The high school students are much better about making choices, but for the students that are between the ages of about 11 and 14, it's a sea of bland. And one of the things I've been trying to get a handle on is the changes that the food service director is trying to put in, how successful they are. So an example is the Jamie Oliver meals. They were trying to make once a month the from-scratch meals, and we went in and we did a survey to see how the students were observing this and participating. Turned out most didn't know who Jamie Oliver was. The parents knew much better than the kids. And secondly, many were not aware of what was being offered in the cafeteria on that day, which just basically says they go in there and they're like a group just with blinders, and they're just kind of going through. They're not necessarily exploring new food options. They kind of get in a set pattern, and so to be able to do that is a real problem. Now, I'm in one of the better school systems. The food service provider, Sodexo, gave my school district a national award for its efforts in sustainability and all these different things. And yet, I don't see these kids eating better. And so I think there's other issues at play in order to change the way our kids think about food and move forward. I'm also studying school gardens. These are some of my students from last semester. I gave them the task to videotape a lesson in a school garden. One of the things that we now have are school gardens in many of our schools, but our teachers don't know how to use them. And so we set about to try and design some lesson plans that will help teachers figure out what to do if they go out there. And it shows that we have adults that don't understand the food that they eat, and that we have to do a lot of education. This is Dorothy Mullins, who is the leading school garden person in all of New Jersey. She has this beautiful garden that not only has food, but has colors. And this was taken last fall. You can see we have a wonderful maple tree there. And these are some of her garden club kids who we have video eating quite happily the peas and the carrots and all the things that you would ever want. And so I'm interested in how they look at their food system, and that these gardens are the things that connect them. So you can see I go from the global to the very local and everything in between. I find that in the Princeton area there's a lot of discussion about local food systems. And in fact, about 2 years ago we had a meeting in a local bookstore in the basement that gathered people interested in the food system. And the farmers told us that it would take about 10 years to really develop a fully robust food system that was localized. And they said that there were a couple things that were the issues. One was skills. How many people actually had the skills to farm locally? 2, land availability. And we've had a lot of land preserved. There's money set aside each year in the budget to allow for certain farmland to be kept as preserved farmland. Does not mean that it has to be farmed actively, but there remains the option to farm it. And then 3 was people's willingness to pay for the cost of producing food locally, that was going to be more expensive. But our own university, Princeton University, actually is one of the leaders. We source as much of 80% of our food from within 150 miles. And for an institution, one of the challenges was to not wipe out the local food supply and not make it available to everybody else. Because it's such a large institution, it deciding to make a change in the farming practices required collaborations with farmers, and not to take over what was already out there, but to develop new relationships. And they keep track very clearly of their vendors. They know who grows the food, and they can go back and negotiate contracts with them directly. So the university has people like the chef here who actually are given the option to create certain menus out of local food. When we talk about local food, though, they often are talking about the vegetables and some of the fruits that we can do, rarely about the grains and that side of it. And I find it interesting that local foods has come to really mean vegetables and not the whole food portfolio. And this is where I started going, wait a minute, when they're talking about it, they're not talking about a whole food portfolio, they're just talking about a small part of it. I also try to provide context in my environmental studies class. This is taking it How Living History Farm. It's actually practicing farming as it was done in about 1910. And we go there and we observe the different techniques, because many of my students are under the assumption that we can just roll back the clock, adopt lots of wonderful animals, beautiful draft horses. There are also 2 oxen that live at this farm named Chris and Charlie, and these oxen get out and do a lot of the work. But I want them to see what it's like, and we usually go during the wheat harvest, because this part of New Jersey used to grow wheat. And we see all the different steps, from preparing the land, planting the seed, all the way through the threshing, and they have a beautiful steam-driven thresher. And you can see the introduction of mechanization, and that the farmers themselves couldn't own this equipment, but it would travel around the valleys and pick up different things. And it's a wonderful way to look at where energy inputs come in. So I think about it with what's doing the work. Is it people? Is it animals? Is it machines? And how should we be thinking about all of those things by providing context? We also spend some time, and I spend a lot of time, thinking about cultural concerns. Because, of course, food isn't just about delivering it, but it's embedded in culture. And this is from one of my favorite artists. His name is Alexis Rockman. This is called The Farm, and it's from the year 2000. What's relevant about this picture was it was made into a billboard, and was a billboard in New York City in 2001, when they had a culture and genetics discussion. And it was prompted in part by genetically modified food. This picture, you can spend a whole day looking at it. And I invite you to go on the web and find it. But it's really to be read from left to right. And it's an interesting story, because Alexis Rockman's mom worked at the Natural History Museum in New York. And he would go and spend his afternoons and wandering around and really learning about the animals. But in here, he's making a real critique. So if we were just to look at the rooster bird here, you know, this is kind of the prototypical bird that you would find. And then this is the more beefed up, breasty hen who's been modified for our taste. So we like white meat and less brown meat. And here is the futuristic hen with multiple wings, because we like chicken wings to eat. Similarly with the cows and the changing of the cows and the udders becoming bigger, so it's more of a milk producer. The pig as a xenotransplantation source, and thinking about harvesting it. Down here, the tomatoes, so the very first genetically modified whole fruit. In fact, my boss at Rutgers was the Vice President of Research and Development during that time. But the idea that we could make tomatoes that were tasty and also could be packaged and shipped are here. Or these vegetables, I think they're, zucchini, that they could be made in a shape that lets them pack better. The soybean fields forever and ever. And so he's making a critique about how we view the world, how we might wish to modify and change the biology to suit our needs, whether it's food or organs or other things. Now he's thrown in a couple other things. You know what this is here? These up here. These are budding yeast. So a lot of genetics is done with yeast. We have the fruit fly, right? We have a mouse with an ear and looking at immunosuppression. We have some corn. We have the idea of breeding animals for prizes, different things embedded in this. So I spent some of my time looking at the cultural ramifications of how people view it and how they respond. We also spent time discussing, or I certainly spent time thinking and discussing about who is influencing food choices. So these are my local farmers, Sherry and Jim, and they run a CSA. and they decide what food is going to be grown and therefore available on a CSA. This is Alice Waters, who's influenced so many restaurateurs in America. You know who this is? Michael Pollan. Read the books like Body of Desire, Omnivore's Dilemma. So we have those who maybe are working behind the scenes or putting out books in the world of ideas. Alice, you know, she's a chef herself, so she can lead. But then we also have the advertising industry, who advertise food to children. We have the Walmarts who are deciding what will be available, changing the food choices. We have websites and access to the internet that will help us make food choices. You know, what meal we want to have when we've gone through all the different menus and still don't like it. We have the government. This is our food pyramid that was redesigned to reflect that we should have activity as well as eating, if you're wondering what those stairs are. And then more recently, I'm starting to think about food from a research point of view with what we should be funding for research, and where there's money to fund and where there isn't money but a need to answer questions and looking at those gaps. So that's when I have my academic hat, but I'm also a consumer, and I'm also a mom of 2 kids and the primary food chooser. And so I think about it, how I talk with just my friends. And in fact, the way that I got into this was when I stayed home when my daughters were young. My friends would come up and say, so, should I feed this baby food to my kids or not? You know, there was this anxiety about what was okay, and genetically modified food came up over and over and over again. And I'm like, I'm a scientist, this is no big deal, right? Thinking science is going to figure it out. I was like, ooh, was I wrong? You know, there were so many other issues going through it. So I think about people at my local market who choose the food, or the grocery store chains. This is a Swiss chard from our Princeton student organic garden that some people get to eat, the organic farms that are around. Thinking about what wonderful food choices I have, but also recognizing that the food choices I have are very different than the ones 10 miles away in Trenton, which is our state capital, which is a food desert. There are no grocery stores in the city of Trenton that has 60,000 people. Okay? And so, in such a small space, that there is such a difference in food availability, and that I have so much more choice than my neighbors, makes me think more about the food system. I also think about what I'm teaching my kids. These are the chickens that are being raised at my house. I don't know if you can see, there's a couple different breeds. I have a friend who was a 4-H leader to my kids, and she's kind of adopted us, and we've adopted her farm. So we're raising chickens right now. We buy our eggs from her during the summer when her hens are laying. She's got older hens. She needed some new ones, so we're raising them for the first 8 weeks or so, and then we're taking them out. So we're learning where our food comes from, literally. Some of these have names, so they won't be meat animals, okay? Rule number 1, don't name your animals if you plan to eat them. And then this is my daughter with the sheep that she raised last year. And this is a Romney sheep that's being bred for wool rather than food. But again, we're lucky enough that we're close to an agricultural place that we can learn these things. I didn't grow up with this. I was a suburban girl. You know, I'm doing all of this as an adult, not as a kid, giving the options. But it makes us think about who is holding the traditions, who's teaching the younger people, and how that information is being passed on. So a lot of the language seems to be located in place or in product. You know, we talk about different kinds of food, we talk about who's making it, and we talk about its geography. And I was fairly happy with that language, and I noticed that it continues to expand. I'm sure we could add to this, so we have the industrial food, we have the conventional food, the fast food, the slow food, the local, organic, sustainable, community, regional. global, ethnic. We could put urban, community garden, all that kind of stuff. And we continue to expand that vocabulary. But I've noticed it's very hard for someone who's sitting in one of these communities, like you have your favorite spot on this list, or if you're the local organic food, to talk to someone who sources their food from another group. And that they have certain assumptions and certain coded words, but it doesn't allow for conversation or an understanding. And we can talk about the agro-food systems. This comes from, this is adapted from a slide I got at an agroecological conference I went to. And that when we think about the food system, it's very complex, right? So we have agricultural production over here. And then we have, depending on the food, the processing. Maybe it's exported because it's made somewhere else. The brokering, the importing, maybe further processing or packaging to wholesaling and retailing. And it can end up in our houses. It can end up in our restaurants or in our institutions. Now, sitting all over this are global, country, or third-party regulations influenced by subsidies, laws, certifications. So a lot of people watching over the food system. Not a lot of people making the food, a lot of people involved in the food system. And then in some way, this feeds back to this, but not always directly. We have transport, distribution, logistics, financial actors, and other activities, government players, playing a role in what's going on over here talks to what's going on here. And so these may be separated in space and time or money. And so it's no wonder that we don't fully understand our food system, because it's very hard to fully understand what happens at all of these steps unless we take specific products and learn what this is for each and every product, or for a company that's sourcing things. So we have organic ice cream producer, Stonyfield. They also do yogurt. And he said that he has a list of ingredients that's 100 long that are sourced from all over the world as well as locally. So if he wants chocolate or vanilla, we're not going to find that in the Northeast. He's got to go looking for it and buy it. Now, when we talk about local food systems, it's something that I think people can get their head around. Here's agricultural production. So this is like my CSA that I drive to. And there's some way to pick it up. And it can go to my household consumption, or some restaurants might buy it. We now have in our area a distribution company called Zone 7 who would fit in here. They actually go to a bunch of different farms. Actually, they go in here, go to a bunch of different farms, pick up produce, and then go and deliver to restaurants. And that was a gap in our local food system. But we still have a lot of the rules and regulations. We still have access to capital, transport, distribution issues that come into this. But I think one reason that the local food system, be that in a suburban area like where I am or in an urban area, has really caught on is I think it's a lot easier to understand this. And therefore see where you fit in and see the connections between what decisions you make and what decisions the farmer makes as far as what's being produced or made. So a term that came into the literature is food sheds. Are you guys familiar with this term? Okay, so how many of you are familiar with a watershed? The idea of a watershed. It's the geographic region that all the water goes into a single river, ultimately. So you would have the Thames River and then all of the water in southern England. And then you would have your rivers. And so the whole area that supplies the water is called the watershed. A food shed is the area from which you draw your food, and often used in more regional settings. So you may have a 100-mile food shed if you're in New York. and most of your food comes from there. Rarely can all of it, because we all eat bananas or get orange juice or something like that. And people have proposed that food shed analyses can be very helpful to understanding the sustainability of a region and its vulnerabilities. And this paper is from 2008, and it really marks the beginning of saying, hey, we should do some food shed analysis. That can be a complicated thing to do, because it will really rely on you understanding all the different pieces that go into the local food shed. And a lot of data was not available, and people have spent a lot of time just collecting data to be able to do this analysis. I think there's a lot of relevance to this, and it's one way to approach this, to think about a food shed. The thing that's very clear about food sheds, though, is it's very geographically located in most of the analysis, that it's done as a local or a regional piece. Much harder to do as a global piece. Another framework that I often use, this comes out of agriculture and the nitrogen nitrogen cycle, and it's the interactions of the whole food chain. So here we are as consumers, just to orient you. Here's primary agriculture, and we often forget that in order for primary agriculture to occur, we need agricultural suppliers, right? That very few farmers are independent to the extent that they need no inputs. So these inputs could be machinery, could be physical structures like hoop houses that they might need, or barns that they might need for animals, or fencing. It could be seeds, it could be herbicides, it could be the agrochemicals they need, the fertilizers. Now, in here we have agricultural policy and environmental policy playing a role. We have the influences of regulations, finance, factors, education, research, extension, some of the things that go on here in the university. And then we have the impacts. But what's interesting about this framework, and why I like to use it, is it shows why it's not just the consumers over here that have an impact on the food chain, but it has a whole another suite of groups and individuals impacting what ultimately goes on over here. So this list is the general public, and you've seen that in the biotech debate, where you've had the general public influencing government and policymakers of saying yes or no, we will or we won't have genetically modified food in our country. We have banks playing an important role. In order for primary agriculture to be able to purchase things, they often need credit. And if they can't get credit, then they can't participate. Extension services, that may be more of an American thing. It's part of our agricultural universities. They do outreach to farmers to help them to be more successful. We have water authorities deciding what the price of water is or is not and what access. Conservation agencies saying you can or cannot farm in certain places. International organizations and NGOs. So this again can be another framework that we can use. And you can see it gets very complicated, and there are a lot of different relationships that can emerge when we look at the food system. So, it's all really good to kind of get behind the food system, but ultimately I think most of us are really asking a very simple question, which is, why do we eat what we eat, and how do we discuss this? So this is from one of my classes. I love taking a picture after an activity, and if we had time I would do this with you. I would ask you, why do you eat what you eat? Do you really know? And I usually have people write things down in groups for a while, and then we put it all up on the board. And as you can see, it's very, very complicated. It could be health. It could be biologically driven. It could be due to culture or cost, availability, the environment, all these different pieces, playing into basically a decision that we make 3 or 4 times a day. Why do we eat what we eat? And so I find this one of the most powerful pieces, because if we don't understand why we eat what we eat, how can we even go talk about the food system, right? So I want to just spend a few minutes here. So it took me a long time to find a framework for this. Warren Velasco came to my rescue. He wrote a wonderful little book called Food, the Basic Concepts, and in it he provided a framework that he called the food triangle. And basically, the apices of this triangle have 3 words: identity, convenience, and responsibility. And he made the argument that every food choice we make usually involves one or more of these. Identity, this could be your cultural identity, this could be related to your age or how you thought about food. It could be your ethnic identity and the food culture that you belong to. It could also be a rejection of certain cultures, and you will not eat certain things and therefore exclude that from your diet. Convenience. Convenience really goes to, is it available? How easy is it to prepare? Do you have the skills to do it? It's also how affordable it is. He talks affordability in here. And most of us spend most of our life in our food choices along this axis. But there's this other one, and I always love this. When I'm teaching an environmental studies class, that the environment is like one of the last things that comes up, or animal ethics and animal rights. So responsibility can include ethics, it can include the environment, but it can also include things like your responsibility to yourself to keep healthy and to feed yourself in a way that's nutritious and to fulfill your basic biological needs. And so for a long time I really found this a useful framework, because I could start to understand why people could not talk to each other. That this group here, we're talking identity, and this group here might be talking about convenience or might be talking about responsibility, and effectively having conversations that had no common terms that would come together. Now, after thinking about this for a while, I came up with the modification, which I call rice, but rice might be a little confusing because you think of it as food, so ICER is my alternative, where I've added the convenience, identity, and responsibility, but added economics, because as many of you know, market forces and cost play such a significant role in deciding why we eat what we eat. And so having this framework, if I go back here and I start going, okay, one of my students said the athletic demands decide how I eat. So there's a certain responsibility to keeping them at a level of performance athletically that requires eating certain things. Religion is part of my identity, or a feast. Some of these very basic things of taste and texture, those are individual things. And so you can go back and look at all these things and say, this is much more about responsibility or identity or convenience or economics. And I started going, wow, I'm moving somewhere. I can really start to understand the food system a bit more by thinking about how people choose what they choose. But these groups are still divided because they don't have their labels or they make assumptions about each other. They stereotype around identity, convenience. And so I came to the point after using this for a couple of years of saying, well, how do I facilitate conversation further? And so to me, it really seemed like discussion about local food, as I said, vegetables, fruits, other things, milk, cheeses, some meat, versus more of the prepared packaged food, that industrial food system. How could we get them to talk? And so I looked for other models. This comes from Erickson's paper from 2008. in which he talks about food systems and their drivers and components of the food system. I find this one quite useful. And the question, though, when confronted with a complicated thing like this is, where do you start, right? Always hard to figure out, where do I start? So if you're looking for the word food security, you start in this box, right? One of your hot topics, the food utilization, food access, food availability. If you're in this box, you go, food systems activity. Maybe I want to talk about producing or processing or consuming, and then this is outcomes. So there are lots of complicated models out there to help us sort this out. But I'm not sure that this is going to help most people have a conversation. It might help us if we're interested in greenhouse gas emissions and how are we going to put the environment into this conversation. But it may not always help us move forward on a bigger conversation. And then I find out that in 1945, George Stigler, who goes on to win the Nobel Prize, really starts asking some really cool questions, which I think simplifies. So the cost of subsistence. So if you remember, we've got World War II going on, and he's asking a very simple question.